There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'm your host, Scott, and joining me for yet another journey into the wondrous land of Twilight Zone podcasting, we once again welcome Joe Fortunato. Good to have you with us again, Joe.
Hello, Scott. Hello, everyone.
Now, on tonight's podcast, we will be focusing on two more Twilight Zone classics, Mirror Image and The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which are the 21st and 22nd episodes from that first season, originally released in late February and early March of 1960. So, let's not waste any time. Let us begin by reflecting on the episode Mirror Image. This episode was directed by John Brahm. Mr. Brahm has been discussed on several previous Twilight Zone podcasts as he was the director of such Twilight Zone episodes like Time Enough at Last, Judgment Night, and The Four of Us Are Dying. We will hear his name once more this season when we get to A Nice Place to Visit, not to mention 7 more times over the course of the entire series run. And, as I foretold in our last podcast, when Mr. Serling made sport of his supposed inability to write for women, this episode was most definitely written by Rod Serling. So let's move on to the cast. It's not a very big one this time around. In the lead role of Millicent Barnes, we have Vera Miles. A Midwestern woman who had even won the title of Miss Kansas back in 1948, Vera Miles started landing relatively minor roles at the start of the 1950s, but she soon attracted the attention of two of the most important and iconic film directors in Hollywood history, Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford. In 1956, Hitchcock paired her with Henry Fonda in his only true crime story, The Wrong Man, and John Ford featured her in his Western classic, The Searchers. One wonders what direction her career might have taken if she had been able to accept the next role offered to her by Hitchcock, but she had to turn it down due to impending motherhood, and it instead went to Kim Novak. Of course, I'm talking about Vertigo. Now, there are rumors and speculation that Hitchcock actually resented Miles due to her getting pregnant and turning down the role, which he had envisioned as a veritable showcase for Miss Miles. I will say I suspect there's perhaps some truth to that, but not to the point where he would have turned his back on her entirely, since she did land a supporting role in Hitchcock's all-time classic film and one of my personal all-time favorites, Psycho, and also, should be noted, a couple years later, she appeared twice on the new Alfred Hitchcock Hour series. One of those episodes was also directed by John Brahm. And circling back to directing icons, I should also mention she appeared in John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, along with two nobodies named, John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. There were other films throughout her career, including reprising her role as Lila Crane in 1983's Psycho 2, but she filled out the bulk of her acting resume over the course of 45 years with a variety of TV roles. I should also mention she actually appeared in the very first episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents way back in 1955, which, as you might guess, was directed by Alfred Hitchcock. I believe it's likely where that relationship started. Quite frankly, she also appeared in the very first episode of The Fugitive, the classic TV show that inspired that terrific movie decades later. Guess what? She also appeared in the very first episode that was shot of I Spy. That was that series with Robert Culp and Bill Cosby, although the actual episode aired midway during the first season. In fact, continuing her habit of first episodes even into the 1970s, she was in the very first episode of Cannon, and would you believe she was in the very first episode of Hollywood Squares? I will also toss in 2 credits that I actually myself recall and have a great appreciation for. She co-starred with Darren McGavin in a pretty darn good episode back in 1981 of Magnum P.I. I always gotta give it up for a Magnum P.I. episode. And of course, if you listen to this podcast, you know I'm going to mention this. She was also the murderess, co-starring with both Vincent Price and a very young Martin Sheen in the 3rd season opener of Columbo back in 1973. She did finally retire from acting in 1995, and guess what? She's going to be 95 this August because she is still with us. Next, in the role of the well-meaning, or was he, Paul Greenstead, we have Mr. Martin Milner. Martin Milner fluctuated between acting in the military service in the early 1950s. Although he had a few minor roles, coincidentally, in military-themed films such as Operation Pacific and Halls of Montezuma, where he met star and producer and eventual employer Jack Webb. This was all before he enlisted in the Army in 1952. He actually credits fellow soldier and actor David Jansen. He was the one who pushed him or persuaded him really to try to make a go of acting. Oh, by the way, another fellow soldier that was serving at the very same military base as those two was a guy by the unlikely name of Clint Eastwood. Now, keeping up, military, isn't that a coincidence? He then lands a small part in the fantastic film, and Joe knows I've mentioned this film before in a different podcast, Mr. Roberts, as well as a recurring role on television's Life of Riley for several years. He'd also appear on a number of TV shows, and yes, some major feature films as well, including The Sweet Smell of Success, Gunfight at the OK Corral, Marjorie Morningstar, and Valley of the Dolls. But Martin Milner is easily remembered, best remembered, I should say, for long-running roles on two semi-classic TV shows. He was that Corvette-driving studly fellow Todd Stiles for 4 years on Route 66, and several years later, he was Officer Pete Malloy for nearly 8 years on Adam 12. And while I don't have another Twilight Zone connection to end with, it should be noted that Milner does play the murder victim on the season 1 premiere episode of Columbo. See, you know I was going to mention Columbo again. Now, that's not the first Columbo. There were technically two before that fall of 1971 premiere. They got Prescription Murder back in 1968, featuring a much more clean-cut Lieutenant Columbo. And in spring of 71, there was A Ransom for a Dead Man. But the Milner episode is likely considered far more notable, not just because it kicks off the first official season of Columbo, because it was Murder by the Book, and that was the one that was directed by Steven Spielberg. Milner did pass away at the age of 83. That was back in 2015. Is there anyone left in this episode? Well, we do have Joe Hamilton playing the perturbed ticket agent. He's one of those actors who started very late in life. He had dozens of smallish roles in the 50s and 60s. You name it. Westerns, crime thrillers, always playing grumpy and annoyed older men. He did play Rutherford B. Hayes on the Bat Masterson TV show, so he had that going for him. He also, unfortunately, dies just 5 years later at the age of 66. Oh, you know what? We have that washroom attendant. Since when do remote bus stations have washroom attendants? A question for a different podcast. That woman, that's Naomi Stevens, who had a very long career appearing in such notable projects as well. Well, you had Billy Wilder's The Apartment the very same year, and she had so many TV roles that ranged from Perry Mason to Jack Benny to Hogan's Heroes, you name it, Man from U.N.C.L.E., Flying Nun, The Odd Couple, all the way to her very last role in a late 1980s episode of Days of Our Lives. So, that's enough of the casting. Let's grab a seat inside the depot here for Mirror Image. And we open with a very cinematic shot of a bus depot side. And as we push in, it's kind of an interior tracking shot inside this Ithaca, New York bus station. It already kind of has a little bit of a Hitchcockian feel, which is only furthered by the fact that we're pushing in on the main character, who's played by Vera Miles. And that is when we hear Mr. Sterling begin his narration. Millicent Barnes, age 25, young woman waiting for a bus on a rainy November night. Not a very imaginative type is Miss Barnes, not given to undue anxiety or fears, or for that matter, even the most temporal flights of fancy. Like most career women, she has a generic classification as a, quote, girl with a head on her shoulders, end of quote. All of which is mentioned now because in just a moment, the head on Miss Barnes' shoulders will be put to a test. Circumstances will assault her sense of reality, and a chain of nightmares will put her sanity on a block. Millicent Barnes, who in 1 minute will wonder if she's going mad. And Rod Serling isn't kidding here, because I can tell you I clocked it at precisely on the second, 2 minutes into this episode during the increasingly testy exchange between Millicent and the cranky ticket agent at the depot, that the first element of oddness and perhaps even horror is introduced. It's that he's annoyed at the fact that this is the third time she has asked him over the past half hour, about when the bus will arrive, while she knows this is the first time she's even spoken to him. She's also troubled by the fact there's a bag in the luggage holding area that looks just like hers, right down to a busted handle. Her mentioning this to the agent only irritates him more as he points out she had checked that bag with him. As she tries to say otherwise, she then realizes her own bag, that was by the bench where she had been sitting, is now gone. Increasingly confused and distressed, she goes to the restroom, where that washroom attendant is concerned about her, especially as she was just in the bathroom. Again, Millicent is confused, but now she's agitated as well. She hasn't been to the restroom before, but she's in for a shock when she opens the door and, as seen in the mirror behind her, she actually sees herself seated at the bench. After momentarily retreating back inside, Millicent calms herself down, trying to convince herself this is all some sort of a delusion. An older couple is no help when she asks if they had seen anyone sitting where she had been, and she eventually resigns herself back to the bench, and then she notices that bag returns by her side as well. She then meets a fellow traveler, Paul Grinstead, who's waiting for the same bus, just going to a different destination. He can see that she's troubled and convinces her to open up, and she tells him about the strange goings-on at the station. He tries to settle her nerves, saying perhaps it's all a joke or a misunderstanding of some kind. Maybe just someone who just happens to look like her. She's maybe slightly convinced. That is until they're about to get on the bus that's arrived, and then she sees her double, looking as smug and frankly quite malevolently evil as can be, seated on that bus. She panics, and she runs back inside the station and faints from the exhausting fear. Paul decides to stay with her. He'll wait till the next bus, which won't be until 7 in the morning. It's about 2:30 a.m. at this point in the story. When Millicent comes to, she has hit upon a theory to explain everything, that somehow there is another plane of existence, which almost sounds like a meta-reference to the Twilight Zone itself. When the plane they're on converges with that other one, our doubles, our doppelgangers, can enter this realm, perhaps with the insidious motivation of taking over their twins' lives. Paul can only nod and say Millicent's contention sounds just a little too metaphysical to him. He is clearly becoming increasingly worried, if not downright wary of Millicent, and although he tells her he's going to call a friend from the neighboring town of Tully to come pick them up, he actually calls the police. They show up and both quickly and rather unceremoniously take Millicent away. Perhaps content that he did the right thing, Paul can only wait the few remaining hours for his bus. He goes to sip some water from a nearby drinking fountain, and he notices his briefcase is now gone. He looks up to see a man bolting out of the depot with his valise, and as he tries to chase after him, we now see that it is a double of Paul, grinning mischievously, not really all that much differently an expression than the one we saw on Millicent Double's face. Then we can cue Mr. Sterling's narration here, obscure metaphysical explanation to cover a phenomenon. Reasons dredged out of the shadows to explain away that which cannot be explained. Call it parallel planes or just insanity. Whatever it is, you find it in the Twilight Zone. Now, for me, I would say perhaps much more than, say, The Hitchhiker, an episode the two of us discussed several weeks ago. Mirror Image is an episode that really stands out for its rather stark and simple execution that really builds the horror moment by moment, from odd to unsettling to disturbing to, quite frankly, horrifying. Now, while it's become something of maybe a hokey or jokey trope in the modern era, that's the concept seems to be more linked to things like daytime soap operas than anything else. This is a much earlier and infinitely creepier take on the evil twin idea or concept. With the idea of doubles, evil twins, doppelgangers, you can find it throughout literature and films and television, comic books, everything from Superman to Star Trek to Twin Peaks and beyond. It's really cemented itself as a small and bizarre niche in the pop culture tapestry. But here, I think the concept and the execution of the evil twin doppelganger here, it's actually even been credited as a direct inspiration for Jordan Peele when he created his cinematic follow-up to Get Out, the movie Us, which was, if nothing else, was a very creepy film. And one should also, Jordan Peele, by the way, very clearly a major Twilight Zone fan. He's one of the main people and writer-producers who helped bring about a brief revival of the Twilight Zone back in 2019. He's actually even the narrator on that. But Joe, this episode, I remembered it pretty well. And I actually maybe admiring it even more now that I'm watching it for a podcast and to really examine it, because for the reasons I just mentioned and beyond, I mean, it does hinge a lot on Vera Miles' performance, which is just right. It doesn't go into hysterics. It doesn't. She doesn't overplay it or overact in any way. And it's as subtle as a Twilight Zone episode could be. I felt it does have that. It's simple things like the bag is there, the bag is not. She only sees her actual quote unquote double, I think, just those two times, and rather briefly at that. But that's enough to make it really kind of scary. And even a thing which I think a lot of people might find weird and troubling, the way she's kind of in, because we don't hear it, the way the police to show up and just kind of whisk her away. I even found that to be kind of scary and creepy, the way it happens just so immediate with that.
Very abrupt, yeah.
It's so abrupt. It's jarring. But I was thinking about it, it's like, I think it's jarring on purpose. I think that actually makes it even scarier that she's immediately just whisked away, kind of almost implying like her life has just been ripped away, so to speak. If that makes any sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, echo all that you said there. And this is another one of those episodes that I'd kind of forgotten. So I was sort of looking at it, almost as if it was fresh eyes. And Vera Miles, I do think, is the anchor here, and also the direction as well. So I don't want to downplay that, but this is almost the Twilight Zone in its most purest form. There's no spaceships, there's no sci-fi. It's just a simple premise with some really fine acting by some pros. And while it, might not be one of the more memorable episodes, it's an excellent sort of definition of what this show is. Like I said, in its purest form, the direction, the narrative, both simple and economical. It's not really over-explained in the narration or in the ending. Like I said, I think this might be a real forgotten gem from season one. And I would almost call this, and kind of is, a bottle episode. And I know viewers of, or listeners of your viewers probably know what that means, but for those who don't, in TV terms, a bottle episode is sort of a self-contained, it's all done in one set. It's usually done for economic reasons at the end of a season because you're running out of money. And this is all pretty much one setting in the bus depot, other than we have she goes briefly into the washroom. But and yet it doesn't feel boring or slow or anything else like that. And like I said, it's just sort of a well done Twilight Zone from everyone involved. And I know that doesn't sound terribly flowery or anything, but that's kind of how I felt. And I know sometimes you don't like to do this, but I always like to sort of check some of the the community feedback and Twilight Zone boards and stuff. And this episode was very surprisingly highly rated by a lot of people. So I don't think it's just us having this reaction.
One of the things I really enjoy about it, going along with what you were saying about the simplicity of it, number one, up until maybe the very last scene, everything about it, as you were describing in bottle episode terms, could very easily be a stage play. It's very much play like a stage play, which I appreciate. But I also like it takes things that are very simple that we can find in our own lives. The idea of kind of like the way deja vu works for us. We've misplaced things and then we find them again and they're right where they were. It's like, wait, that wasn't there before, or we think that, whatever. We think we see something out of the corner of our eye, which might not quite be what it is, or whatever. We see something we think looks like someone and turns out not to be that person. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this episode, one of the inspirations for it that Rod Serling himself said when he was trying to sell the show to, I think it was to a Dutch television station, I think is where I read this. He claimed he gotten the idea that based on something that happened to him at an airport. Things always happen to Rod at an airport, it seems. He had noticed that there was a man at the other side of the terminal who was wearing the same kind of outfit and was carrying the same suitcase. And then Sterling had the thought, way writers always do, he considered what would happen if this man turned around and it turned out to be a duplicate of himself. Of course, when the guy turned around, as Serling put it, the guy turned out to be far younger and more attractive than he was. But like I said, I love how little ideas like that can lead to, an episode like this. It's
I think the younger, more attractive version of Rod Serling is Don Draper. But
yeah, pretty much. The only difference between them is that Draper's probably more than a little bit taller than him. Because it's always one of those things when you all of a sudden you realize, did you realize how short Rod Serling was? Look at him in a photo with like any other actors. It was like, oh my God, he's tiny. But yeah, I think this is probably one of those, compared to the more legendary, iconic episodes, which we're getting to shortly. This might be fall into the category of one of those little unearthed treasures you kind of might have overlooked or forgotten about. Kind of like that episode, The Lonely, that we talked about, also earlier this season. See, we get the iconic episodes, Joe, and we also get the little gems, so it makes up for the crappier
well,
ones.
it's nice to get them both in one podcast.
Oh yes, I mean it's two sides of the same coin, and it's a coin that's worth a whole lot of money. So let me get to the checklist here. The tone of this episode, oh my Lord, it's creepy, it's suspenseful, it's scary, it's all those things. It's all the things a really good Twilight Zone should be, unless you're doing a funny one. One thing this episode isn't, it's not funny. Okay, tropes. Well, we've got this bus station, bus depot kind of thing. I feel with buses or trains, we see more than a few stations like that over the course of history on this series. We've got the concept of evil twins and doubles, the concept of a parallel universe. That certainly comes up again. Oh, hey, look, there's a bus and a bus driver. We see a bunch of those. We have a main character being taken away by the authorities, who's also a main character who's eventually proven right about what that person is insisting on. We're certainly going to see both of those when we get to a really iconic episode of the Twilight Zone.
It's already playing in my head right now.
We know the one I'm talking about. So let's get to my grades. Okay. My grade for the ending for this one, I rate it fairly high. We didn't really get into it's based on obviously the limitations of special effects. The shot of Martin Milner running away from Martin Milner I almost think it helps it look that much more bizarre. It's a very weird image of him running in front of himself, the way it's superimposed that way. But it's a great reveal. Some might regret the fact that we end the story with a character who wasn't the main character, but that's certainly not the first time that's happened, and I don't think that's quite that big a deal. I'm going to give the ending an 8.5. I think it's a really strong ending, and I'm really thinking of, from the point it's when his briefcase is gone and realize, oh, it's going to keep happening. That 8.5 is also the grade I'm going to give the episode overall. So it's an 8.5 across the board for me.
Good stuff. I mean, I let you do the grades. I don't do the grades, but I did also note that, hey, she kind of exits this episode about 2 or 3 minutes earlier than maybe she should. And then talking about the special effects, for a moment, I was thinking, wait a minute, is that a different actor than Martin Milner or not? Because, I mean, it was clearly supposed to be, the doppelganger, but for whatever reason, either the angle or the lighting or whatever, I'm like, I'm not entirely sure that's not a different actor. I was wrong, but still, it bumped me for a moment.
Well, I will point out one little jokey thing before we move on. I think Vera Miles should be used to being in at this point, should be used to being in something where, hey, wait, we didn't stick with the main character left the story a lot sooner than I thought.
That actually, before we move on again, and this actually kind of applies to almost all the episodes we do, but I was looking at it, I kind of want to get the timeline of Vera Miles' career because, she had done some big stuff prior to this and even post this, as you pointed out earlier when you were going over her filmography. And, we tend to think a lot of times, oh, that's that Twilight Zone episode with so-and-so before they were a star, before they were known, like Robert Redford or whatever it might be. But a lot of times, they're getting pretty good known quality actors in a lot of these episodes. And also we tend to think back in those days there was more of a division between TV actors and movie actors, which, you know, is kind of gone by the wayside in the last 10 or 20 years. But you know, this is a perfect example of that. I mean, she's not an unknown quantity, but she's bringing her A game to this TV show.
Right. I think at the very least, when we're going through a show like The Twilight Zone, you will come across, um, quite often, it's more often will be character actors who might have already gotten themselves established in films and then also did a Twilight Zone episode. The ones that the only ones you're unlikely to see are people who were out and out stars. We see people before they become stars on the Twilight Zone, but as you point out, but we still will get people that people know who they are. People recognize them, but they might not be people who will get fannies in the seats, as they used to say back in the day. But still, you know, as we went through her credits and a couple of people we're going to mention on the upcoming episode, there were people who, you know, people will recognize from the silver screen, not necessarily just another TV show or something.
But it's also something I've noticed too during this rewatch, that when we see Serling promoting the next episode, it's this will be starring so and so and so and so, and you're thinking, well, they're big enough names to that they're, you know, promoting them, which is you know, a little bit jarring to me from my, you know, 60 years later perspective or whatever it is.
Right. Gotcha. So let's move on to what is truly a bona fide iconic classic of this series. And as I already used Serling's words to intro this episode last week, I will just get right to the story behind the credits of The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. Now, this episode was directed by Ron Winston. Ron Winston got a start in the business. His first directing job was on an episode of The Johnny Carson Show in 1956, several years before Carson hosted The Tonight Show. This was a show based around sketches, skits, comedy routines, and so on. Winston had several other TV directing jobs before this episode of Twilight Zone, perhaps the most notable being an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness for Playhouse 90. Post-Twilight Zone, he did direct a number of other TV series, ranging from Branded and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. to his very last two jobs, which were episodes of Hawaii Five-0 and McMillan and Wife. Sadly, he died of a heart attack while en route to the airport preparing to scout locations for an upcoming project. And I say sadly because he was only 40 years old. Oh, by the way, he did direct two other Twilight Zone episodes, The Big Tall Wish, which we will be talking about a little later this season, and then one of the very last episodes of the Twilight Zone that's late in the fifth season, the episode titled A Stopover in a Quiet Town. The episode was written by Rod Serling. A personal note here, I have to confess. I always forget that Serling wrote this episode himself. I often think this was a Richard Matheson episode because it has the kind of devilish twist I tend to associate more with his work than King Serling. I'll talk about that a little later when Joe is talking about the episode, because I have a few more thoughts along those lines. But let's take a look at some of the members of this cast. We have to start with the man who plays Steve Brand, perhaps the sole rational man on the street, and that would be Claude Akins. Southern-born and Midwestern-raised, Akins served in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in World War II. Came back, graduated from Northwestern University, got a degree in the theater arts, and he was a Shakespearean-trained actor, which I suspect a lot of people would not have guessed. He did pursue acting for a living on stage, and then he gets signed by a well-known talent agent, Meyer Mishkin. Mishkin repped a slew of actors that became known as Meyer Mishkin's Band of Uglies, a group of thespians that included actors such as Akins, Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, James Goburn, and Chuck Connors. He did land a number of noteworthy film roles, small roles in pictures such as From Here to Eternity, Rio Bravo, and The Caine Mutiny. After his Twilight Zone appearance, he had a rather significant role in Inherit the Wind, but really after that, TV roles became more the norm. I mean, you know, he did star in the sequel to The Magnificent Seven. Do people even remember there was a sequel to that movie? There was also The Devil's Brigade, which was another one of those unit of wacky personalities in World War II banding together for some sort of adventure, kind of like Dirty Dozen or Kelly's Heroes. This movie featured a cast with William Holden, Cliff Robertson, Richard Dawson and Carol O'Connor, who I think he was in Kelly's Heroes too. So maybe he's the same character in both of those. I don't know. I think that's mostly supposed to be Canadian, that film. But as I said, he's probably better known for his TV roles, be it several episodes of Gunsmoke, the Trucker TV series he was in the mid-70s that was called Move In On, make sure I get that apostrophe in there. I'm actually shocked he didn't show up on Columbo because he did appear on both McMillan and Wife and McCloud, which if memory serves, they were all part of the same rotation of the NBC mystery movie. But clearly he's probably best known for the spinoff from BJ and the Bear, The Misadventures of Sheriff Lobo. Before I skip to the next cast member, I do kind of want to point out one odd thing with Mr. Akins. I've kind of going over all his roles. Unless my eyes deceived me, he played a sheriff in at least 16 different TV series or movies. And that does not include the dozens of times he was some sort of an officer of the law, identified either as a sergeant or a captain or a marshal. So he was definitely a type. Oh, by the way, he does appear in another Twilight Zone episode, season 3's The Little People. Next, we have Jack Weston as Charlie Farnsworth, the most gung-ho of the paranoid neighbors. Weston had a career that spanned roughly 30 years, appearing in films and television, from villains to comical roles. His most notable appearances beyond this Twilight Zone episode, well, he is one of the bad guys menacing Audrey Hepburn in Wait Until Dark. 14 years after that, not only did he co-star the Alan Alda film The Four Seasons, he subsequently reprised his role in the TV series that was spun off from that film. Other memorable appearances include roles in the original Thomas Crown Affair, Dirty Dancing, and you know what? I actually have a pretty keen memory of him appearing in an episode of All in the Family. Once again, bringing it back to Twilight Zone, he does appear in one more episode, season 4's The Bard. And that one, he actually co-stars with his then wife at the time, Marge Redmond, who some people, not me, would know from The Flying Nun. Next, we have Barry Atwater. He's also sometimes known as Garrett Atwater. Sometimes he's known as GB Atwater. But here he plays Les Goodman, the first person placed under the Maple Street microscope. He was the son of a famous landscape painter by the same name, guessing Barry. Atwater was a go-to character actor who appeared in a number of films and mainly TV series from the 50s through the 70s. Guess what? He was Serac in the Savage Curtain episode of Star Trek. You know, the one with Abraham Lincoln. I think that's been referenced on this podcast before. More coincidentally, he played Lincoln on the Twilight Zone-esque series, One Step Beyond. He actually appeared in that show twice, and he also had a pair of appearances on the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. And you know, even though he showed up 3 times on Hawaii Five-0, and 4 times on Dr. Kildare and Mannix and Police Story, and 5 times on Gunsmoke and Mission Impossible, 6 times on Perry Mason, he never appeared again on the Twilight Zone. But he does appear twice in Rod Serling's later series, Night Gallery. So that's something. Anyway, he died at the age of 60 from a stroke. Even though he had been battling cancer for several years leading up to that. I just like mentioning when people die on this podcast for some reason.
I want to interject a quick thing of it since it won't be relevant later. But, you know, playing that, I learned that when he was playing a Vulcan, as he did, he couldn't do the Vulcan salute with his hand, which I can't either, by the way. So he had to position his hands into the Vulcan salute off screen before he would raise it to camera height to do it. So a little insight there for our Trek fans.
Now I'm going to swing back for who portrayed the rather sneeringly accusatory Don Martin. That was played by Burt Metcalf. Now, whereas Burt Metcalf appeared in a number of TV series in the 1950s through the mid-60s, things like Gidget, Have Gun Will Travel, The Outer Limits, Perry Mason, hey, The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, and 34 episodes of the TV series Father of the Bride, none of those are likely to be the reason his name might seem slightly familiar to some of you. You might be going, why does that name ring a bell? Burt Metcalf. Well, you see, Mr. Metcalf made a rather major career readjustment, and he became a leading player behind the scenes. And his most notable work, without a doubt, was his involvement throughout the entire series run of the television series MASH. He really was one of the main guiding forces behind that series, from casting the entire ensemble for the pilot to helping to determine the tone, the content, and the messaging of the show. Not to mention that he worked side by side with Larry Gilbert and Gene Reynolds to do an ungodly amount of research in matters both medical and military, literally interviewing hundreds of doctors, many of whom actually served in the armed services during the Korean War. He also had a few writing credits of his own on his time on MASH, and he directed 31 episodes of the series. So, chances are, if you're someone who watched MASH and fairly regularly, you just might recognize his name from the credits for many an episode there.
And when I saw his credits here, I had to double take and double check because I can wait a minute. That can't be the same guy. And of course it was.
Damn straight. Now, of the remaining members of the cast, in the interest of time, and quite frankly, just plain old interest, I would say maybe it's worth pointing out that two of the women in this episode do reappear in later Twilight Zone episodes. Anne Barton, who plays Myra Brand, aka Steve's wife, she will also appear in the season 2 episode of Shadow Play. And Mary Gregory, who plays Sally, she doesn't get to have a last name, she also appears in season 2's Lateness of the Hour and season 3's The Shelter. And with that, you've heard enough from me. It's time I make good on my promise, and I cede the spot to Joe, who will tell us far more about when those monsters are due on Maple Street.
Well, thank you, Scott. And before I move on from the casting, you missed one thing on Jack Weston there that's one of my personal favorites, and that would be the incredible Mr. Limpet. But for those who know that film, always a fun thing, of course, with Don Knotts. But I digress. Let's talk about episode 22, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And this originally aired March 4th, 1960. Time magazine called this one of the 10 best Twilight Zone episodes. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves in our rankings, but I thought I'd mention that out of the gate. And let's start with Mr. Serling's opening narration. Maple Street, USA, late summer. A tree-lined little world of front porch gliders, barbecues, the laughter of children, and the bell of an ice cream vendor. At the sound of the roar and the flash of the light, it will be precisely 6:43 p.m. on Maple Street. And then there's some neighbors and there's some footage, and they see the light that Serling mentions, and the narration continues. This is Maple Street on a late Saturday afternoon. Maple Street is the last calm and Maple Street in the last calm and reflective moment before the monsters came. And that's where we end the narration. And I'll just kind of do the summary here briefly. A peaceful suburban neighborhood is thrown into chaos after a sudden, unexplained power outage holds all electricity, phones, and car engines. Then when a young boy, the neighborhood boy, suggests that the disruption might be the work of alien invaders, similar to a comic book he had read, who have sent scouts disguised as humans, the neighbors begin to grow suspicious of one another, and paranoia starts spreading quickly as minor differences and odd behaviors of each of the neighbors are scrutinized, leading to finger pointing, accusations, and ultimately violence amongst the once friendly residents of Maple Street. As the tensions boil over and the street descends into mob rule, it's revealed that the power outage was, in fact, orchestrated by actual aliens observing from above or far away from the street. They note how easily humans can be manipulated into self-destruction with just a few small disruptions of their routines. And then the paranoia will just take over and they'll take care of themselves. And the episode delivers a chilling commentary on fear, prejudice, and the fragility of social order, making it one of the most powerful allegories in the Twilight Zone canon. And then we close with Serling's narration. The tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, to be found only in the minds of men. For the record, prejudices can kill and suspicion can destroy, and a thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout all of its own. For the children and the children yet unborn. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined only to the Twilight Zone. And kind of hammers it right there on the head that this is an allegory. And I'll have more to say on this after I kind of turn it back over to you. But, this is very much in keeping with the times of 1960 in terms of post communist Red Scare and right in the middle of the Cold War. So this is Serling basically saying this is what we're doing and this is the times we live in.
Right. This is probably among the upper echelon of Twilight Zone episodes that are most definitely a social and political commentary of the times. And that's probably the thing I needed to remember when earlier I mentioned how I had initially always remembered this as a Richard Matheson penned episode and not Rod Serling, because so much of it feels like a Richard Matheson story. And I'll be more specific about that in a second. But one of the main differences between the two of them is that Serling was certainly more predisposed to making such political and social commentaries than Matheson was, really. Not that Matheson didn't do that at all, but that was really more Serling's bread and butter than it was Richard Matheson. I think it's just the nature of people being manipulated and turning on each other slowly but surely. That's something that Matheson himself has hit upon in his stories. He has an especially chilling story like that, and he accomplishes it and within just a few, I want to say 15 pages. And then some guy named Stephen King ends up taking that idea and running with it for like 800 plus pages in Needful Things, which is clearly just the same thing. King gives it up for saying Matheson was his biggest inspiration for his work. So I'm not going to say he was ripping him off. But I was actually gratified when I realized this was Rod Serling, just a Rod Serling story, because it kind of renewed my faith in, no, Rod sometimes could write some of the best damn episodes of the series. And this, by far, in my opinion, is one of the best episodes of the series. Twilight Zone, as we've spoken about before, and we'll have a little chat right now, I think, of 150 something episodes, 156, 157, something like that, there's a handful that are considered the truly iconic episodes. We've already covered one earlier this season with Time Enough at Last. This, I believe, is another one of those episodes. And it's interesting how, for me personally, and I think we might be on the same page, we certainly were with Time Enough at Last, some of those classic iconic episodes, we will concede how important and how iconic they are, but they might not necessarily be among our favorites. But it's nice when you get an iconic episode that actually is one of our favorites. And for me, this is by far, I don't know if it's not my number one choice, but it's probably in my top 5. I think it might be in my top. If I was to construct such a list, I have not done it. I don't really want to do it, but I think it would be there because I've always had such a great affection for this episode. Watching it again, I appreciated it all over again.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. And in fact, when we were, for the listeners' benefit, when we were kind of deciding how we were going to break down all the episodes of this first season and who was going to co-host with you and whatever, this was the only, well, not the only one, but this one and Time Enough at Last, I raised my hand and said, I really want to be on that podcast. And you were gracious enough to accommodate me. But this is one I requested because it is one of my favorites and it is truly iconic. And in fact, for 5 minutes in my career, I actually taught high school English one year, and we were teaching The Crucible, and I also taught this as a companion piece because it's certainly of that same sort of ilk. It's also kind of in the tradition of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, and there's a lot of different famous plays, short stories, or whatever that talk about paranoia, witch hunt, things like that, and this fits right in there with any classic piece of literature or stage play or whatever, I think. And it doesn't disappoint because you're afraid when you go back and look at this and you think, oh, is it going to be as good as I remember? And it kind of was. I do have one little nitpicky thing that I'll bring up. You want me to bring it up now, or should we wait a second? I don't know if you have something else to say.
You can bring it up now. I mean, I was going to layer in a few more positivities and it's just stuff that's occurred to me as I've been talking about it, mainly because the thing that just popped in my head is you can't see it because the TV camera that we TV camera. Wow, the computer camera isn't angled that way, but to this side of me, and it's an audio podcast, so I'm raising a hand so Joe knows what I'm talking about because we do this with video images. There's a movie poster up above me here, and it kind of obviously I just made the link between that and this episode about when you had stories of that time. We're talking like mid to late 50s going into like the early 60s, and this came out in 1960, so obviously it was written probably sometime in most likely in 59, probably was even filmed in 59 before it aired in 1960. And when you had as you say, the allegory like stories that really prey upon a person's paranoia and their distrust of their neighbor and people unlike that. And the movie that I'm looking at as I angle my head is probably one of the most famous cinematic versions of that idea, which is Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Exactly.
And I'm looking at this, and I remember thinking, as I was watching this, it was reminding me of how much I love Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is also kind of like, it's, suburban America and how people are turning on one another or whatever. But in the Twilight Zone story, it's, it's the fear of the other and aliens, even though it's not actually true. Although then the twist is, oh, guess what? It actually is.
Well, this is, this is like maybe the writer in me that sometimes looks probably excessively so for little plot holes that might need to be plugged or whatever. And I don't even know if I'd call this a plot hole because like I said, the story works for me. I don't even want to discredit that, but it does beg the question of the character of Tommy, the young boy who brings up the whole idea of the aliens in the first place. If he had never said anything, does the whole thing kind of fall apart? He's pretty important in setting up or planting that seed of paranoia, but the aliens couldn't predict that Tommy was going to say, "Hey guys, I just read this comic book, and we should beware." And that little thing just bothered me a little bit this time. I almost wish it had been layered a little bit in the writing. Maybe like, oh, you know what? Because Tommy's very sure of this. Oh, don't go away, Mr. Steve. This is what's going to happen, and the aliens are going to come. And he's a teenager. He's not a young boy, so it's kind of a little weird. And it would have helped me a little bit if even he himself had said, "Oh, you know what? This is kind of stupid." No, Tommy, tell us what you're thinking. Well, I just read this comic book, and this is what happened. But that's silly. No, tell us more, Tommy. That kind of thing would have helped sort of smooth over that little thing. But I'm not going to let it ruin the episode for me. It's just sort of like, hey, the aliens didn't plan Tommy, and he's pretty critical in, setting the plot, loose.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's true. I will then look at it this way, that what the aliens are doing, it's also because it's confined to literally a street, a neighborhood. So think of it as they're running an experiment, and maybe they've done this several times before. Maybe it doesn't always work, and
Yeah, very
because there isn't a Tommy, but then sometimes it will. One of the things I kind of love about this story is when you take it to its horrific ends that we don't see on screen. And apparently this was quote unquote confirmed somewhere else in some sort of book somewhere. I read that. I was like, well, unless Rod Serling himself wrote that book, and I don't think he did, and it wasn't taken from the notes, I don't know if that's really true, but I don't see any other way it ends. Because if you really think about it, we watched the end of the episode, and it's the aliens leaving, getting on their ship and leaving, floating around maybe to find the next neighborhood to go prey upon. But we leave Maple Street in chaos. They're all going to kill each other. We realize that's the way that story ends. The idea is they're not surviving. We see them all taking, different types of weapons and things at the end, grabbing guns and shovels and pitchforks and God knows, maybe not pitchforks, I don't remember. It's like, Tommy's going to be crucified somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, but I actually even like that part when this also gives me a chance to shout out Jack Weston, because he does turn on Tommy. It's like they point the finger at Tommy, and so even he as a boy is not immune to this. And like I said, I wanted to just give a shout out to Jack Weston because he's so perfectly cast here. And maybe because of his look and his just sort of kind of little weaselly appearance sometimes. He often plays someone who's kind of weaselly or smarmy or, flat out villain in a couple of the cases that you mentioned, but he's so good at that part, and he's perfectly cast here as sort of the paranoid foil of this whole thing.
I just love how, although there's a lot more to this episode than, say, Mirror episode, as far as, a much bigger ensemble cast. It's an outdoor set, the Suburban Street, which apparently has been used and reused for a number of other things over the years as well. Um, but again, it's the simplicity of it. Basically, all of a sudden nothing is working, except all of a sudden the lights are going on in this one house, or this engine happens to start and then it stops. Just those little things are just enough to set everybody not just on edge, but against one another. And it's nice when the main character, or ostensibly the main character, who I believe to be the Claude Akins character, because he's the one, person trying to remain rational here, and his turn isn't to go to feed into the mob rule, but it's to go against the Jack Weston character because he just murdered a man. And, it's like he deserves what's going to happen to him now, the way he's about to be castigated and actually almost stoned to death, quite frankly. He was like, well,
Talking about the lottery, yeah.
he just killed the poor handyman he just went over to the next neighborhood to see what was going on. We'll never know what he was coming back to say.
I do think, by the way, I don't think it registered with me in the past when I had seen this as much, but the stoning, just those images of people grabbing the stones, is so biblical
Yes.
and just so base human. That is our first weapon as human beings, is a rock, is a stone. And I found that very profound, to use that sort of imagery.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that it's almost the violence devolving into stones, as opposed to, every other person being armed the way with that one shotgun and whatever. Um, it's just a really terrific episode. Although it is weird, when I was going over the cast, I was originally going to go over all the different people on it, and I kind of tried to limit myself. Um, One of the actresses who's in it, whose name I didn't specify, I found it weird because visually she's the one I facially recognize the most, because I've seen this actress on so many things.
Yeah.
But they never give her a name. She's listed in the credits as woman. It's like, wait, they're all neighbors. Why is she the only person who doesn't get a name? The handyman gets a name. Why doesn't she get a name? She has a lot to say in this episode, and she never gets a name. She's just woman. Oh, that's why.
Yeah, and we've seen her on a number of 60s sitcoms and whatnot.
Oh yeah, definitely a lot of sitcoms. And it's funny talking about someone who I didn't even name, but yeah, it's a really great episode just because of everything we've already said. And you know, Jack, I mean, obviously when you have established actors like Weston and Akins, but I really like all the minor characters throughout. They all serve a purpose, and the way they're acting and reacting to each other. And quite frankly, Burt Metcalf is actually really good, and to a degree where it's like, wow, he could have kept on being an actor, but I think he made the right call, and probably financially, probably definitely made the right call with what he did in MASH. Although he does appear as a driver in one episode of MASH, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think that might be his last acting credit. I was like, driver on MASH.
But one kind of thing about just sort of this iconic place in Twilight Zone history, maybe we'll account for all these when we're done with these all the seasons of this. But I think it's probably fair to say that many, if not most, Twilight Zone episodes are an allegory of some kind, and some hit more than others. And I think this one hits so squarely perfectly, and it's an allegory that we can all relate to, of paranoia and name calling and mob rule, and it's timeless, because even though it was very specific to this time in the post McCarthy era, in the Cold War and whatnot, we're dealing with it today too. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that this episode really does stand out in the Mount Rushmore of the series.
Absolutely. It's also, if I'm not mistaken, it's also one of the series that they've riffed on The Simpsons quite often, just like
Yeah.
they've done with Time and Effort Last and To Serve Man. Because there's always certain episodes that, they can just make a gag on. I think whenever you had it, the Treehouse of Horror episodes and the two aliens were watching, what was it, Kang and like Kodos, right? And it's always, the concept is always spoofing the two aliens at the end of this, watching what they've done.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna start to go through my checklist here. But obviously jump in with anything else that occurs to you while I'm talking. Feel free. The tone of this one. I love the tone of this one because you've got the suspense, you've got paranoia, you've got the tension that tightens, you've got the eventual descent into madness. To me, it's kind of like what you were saying. Um, and for both of the episodes we've talked about tonight, because they both, I think, fulfill just that's what a Twilight Zone is meant to be or should be in our mind. I mean, the only thing the two episodes don't have, we got the two that are not in the comedic sense. So as far as just pure drama or horror or whatever you want to refer to it as, these are like really nicely distilled versions of what if I was to show someone an episode of Twilight Zone for the first time, I probably would go with this one because it's so damn good. But Mirror Image wouldn't be a bad one to show either. They both be like really indicative of what the show could be and really was for a good chunk of its run. Anyway, sorry. Where was I? Oh, tropes. Tropes. You got your paranoia, you got suburbia, you've got your distrust among neighbors. Well, you've got a death. You always have to mention death. You've got writing. You've got aliens taking over the world. You've got the analogies and the allegories to McCarthyism and the Red Scare at all. And God knows what else I've left out because, hey, there's a gun. And of course, a gun does play an important part at some point. So let's throw the gun in there too. Let's get to the grades. This was one of my most fun ones to grade. My grade for the ending. The ending gets a 10. I gave Time Enough at Last a 10. I'm giving this one a 10. And I'm also going to say it because if you were watching this for the first time and you weren't familiar with any parodies or spoofs or references, whatever, you might not necessarily guess the very ending. You might have a suspicion of it. You might. But you might not get it on the nose the way what happens here. Unlike some other ones where you're like, oh, you know what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen. I don't feel that's the case with this one as much as it is with a few other of the more iconic episodes. And it's just, I find it to be satisfying and such between when we pull back and the town is just, everyone's running after each other, which is kind of a horrific image, especially when you think it's 1960 and you start thinking of, the era of riots and whatever. And here's one in suburban America, whatever, to the detached aliens looking at everything, and they look just like us. Of course they do. And what they say, the little cold description, I think it works so well. It's just like, so good. My grade for the episode. It will be my highest grade I've bequeathed any episode so far, and probably will be for this season. My grade is going to be a 9.5. Why am I not giving it a 10? Because I only have one or two episodes I would give a 10 to, so it's not going to be this one. But 9.5 means it's right there. It's an almost perfect episode. Maybe one of the things that, Joe, that you mentioned might be a slight shortcoming of it. That's one possibility. Maybe not naming the woman character. No, I'm just kidding. But but it works so well. I was so happy to rewatch it again. It's one of those that it's one of the episodes I probably have rewatched so many times, and I always enjoy it every single time I've watched it. And this week was no different than any other time I've seen it.
Just before we run out of time here, I just wanted to, for those who like this sort of thing, a couple of production notes. The Maple Street was MGM's Andy Hardy Street, when they did the Andy Hardy films with Mickey Rooney and stuff, and the production actually used that street a number of times whenever they had suburbia or something like that. And then in the end, the some of the props, the uniforms of the aliens were borrowed or used or redressed from Forbidden Planet, a classic sci-fi film. And some of the props and stuff were used for the alien ship that were part of Forbidden Planet. So there's a lineage there as well, even just in the production.
So, as we take our leave from Maple Street, not to mention that desolate bus depot somewhere in upstate New York, Ithaca, I believe, the driver can punch our ticket to bring this podcast to a close. Joe, as always, it was most satisfyingly delightful to have you here tonight.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm always love being part of the podcast. And anybody who wants to check me out can go to my website, joefortunato.net, and see what I'm doing.
As for you, our intrepid listeners, we will return in 2 weeks or thereabouts to have another in-depth discussion about 2 more Twilight Zone episodes. The 23rd episode of Season 1, which is A World of Difference, which is also another episode that most definitely was written by Richard Matheson. And, the 24th episode was written by Mr. Charles Beaumont. That would be Long Live Walter Jamison. Till then, I hope you all will join us then. Thank you, and good night.